Welcome to episode 7, the 5th day of creation, as we continue our journey through the details of Genesis 1. And today, on the 5th day, we're parallel to the 2nd day, and so that 2nd day was the separation of the waters, and now we'll see what happens in the waters. And we may be surprised by a number of things here, not least of which is that the birds come from the waters, and we'll look at that in a second, but also that in the Greek at least, it suggests that the animals have souls. So let's look closely and see what our authors, both in Hebrew and in Greek, have to say that may relate to issues that we've struggled with the Bible and may be liberated from some of those struggles by this little bit of work. So again, we go back to our outline, which showed the relationship between these different days. And here's the 5th day corresponding to the 2nd day of the waters, and we'll see swarms of living creatures and birds from the waters. We'll see the differentiation of sea and air animals, and we'll see for the first time two new expressions. God's blessing and the command to be fruitful and multiply. And then we'll see that repeated on the 6th day. So there's something now happening as the poem comes to its climax that's linking what's being created in the 5th day with what's being created in the 6th day, and keeping that separate from the things that were created earlier, the lights in the sky and the vegetation on the earth. So we'll look both in this session and the next session at how those fit together. And we'll also see the Hebrew word chaya for life 7 times between these 2 days, also linking what's happening here in the 5th and 6th days. So let's look a little more closely at our text as we go here. So as we've been seeing, it starts with "then God said." And as we saw with the vegetation, where it suggested let the earth bring forth, but we saw that in the Hebrew it was the verb and the noun were parallel, so let the green forth. Here it's very similar. Let the waters swarm a swarm, or let the waters swarm swarms. Depending upon how you look at it, it'll be parallel to here later in the verse, let flyers fly. So you can see from the Hebrew here, even if you can't read the Hebrew directly, perhaps you can see the shape of these 3 consonants here. The Shem, the Ro, and the Zeta are the same as here. This one looks a little different at the end because when some of these end a word on the left side, they have a little tail on to indicate the end of a word, but these are the same 3 consonants that form those words. So the interlinear here carries some of that sense, abound with an abundance, but more specifically that sense of swarming, things from the water swarming. So let the waters bring forth. This sounds like it's going to be parallel to let the earth bring forth vegetation, but there the earth simply brought forth. Here God will create these things. And there's an ambiguity in between verse 20 and 21. Some scholars would suggest that waters bring forth a swarm of living creatures here, and the flyers fly, and then this is something else going on in verse 21. We'll see how those relate in just a moment. So let the waters swarm forth swarms of what? In the Hebrew, nefesh chaya, which is a very important phrase. Nefesh is the phrase for a living being. It will be, as we'll see later in the chapter, what the human being is described as a nefesh. And also if you think of it as the J version, or at least the Garden of Eden story from whatever author, we see here also that the Adam becomes a nefesh, a living being here. So the living beings from the water and the living being of the human are described in the same term in Hebrew, nefesh. And then in the Greek, there's 2 issues going on here. One is the specifics of living creatures are sounding more like they're reptiles. Herpeta, sukon, zoson. Herpeta, though, which suggests a herpetology and hence a study of reptiles. Brueggemann notes a semantic range of the terms in general Greek included everything from snakes to 4-footed animals. And in fact, the Hebrew as well, because if we were to look later at the noun for tanim, for sea monsters, that will also include a wider variety of things: serpents, sea monsters, crocodiles perhaps, and other things like that. But that first word from the Greek, pasukon, in its normal form pasuke, as you can see there in Greek the P is pronounced, it looks very much like the English word psyche. And if you were to ask a psychologist, what do you study, and they would say the psyche, they might be surprised to find out that psyche is the Greek word that gets translated in many places in English as soul. But do psychologists study the soul? Is the psyche the same thing as the soul? And not only that, this says that these creatures coming forth from the water have them, have a psuche. So what is the point here is not to reason backwards from the later Greek notion of the soul brought into Christian theology in a post-biblical world and then try to figure how that fits back into our story. That doesn't make any more sense of Genesis than trying to read it again in relation to Darwin or things from our world. Rather, what we need to note is the Greek translators of the Hebrew Nefesh Chaya were using the language they have, and the psuche before it was subject to Platonic interpretation in that context, although Plato would have existed before the Septuagint was translated by at least 100 years, if not 200. But for the biblical authors who are not Platonists, they're trying to render the Hebrew in a way that made sense. And so a Nefesh Chaya is not a creature with a soul, it's a creature that's living. It's a living being, and that will also play out, as we'll see, into the book of Revelation, in those who are gathered around the throne using different language, but we'll see how that plays out as well. The Zoe is the word that plays out there, Zoe being one of two Greek words for life, along with bios, but the one that's most used in the Bible. So, swarms of living creatures, and let flyers fly. Notice above the earth, across the dome of the sky. There's a couple issues here. Literally, it's across the face of the dome, alpane. It's just as we saw the Spirit hovering, or the wind hovering over the face of the deep, of the Tehom in verse 2, as noted here. Here, the dome has a face. So the deep has a face and the dome has a face. Part of the common expression, as we'll see, the earth has a face as well. So across the face of the sky, and the Greek Septuagint adds in it was so, but there is no it is so here in the Hebrew, and so the New Revised Standard has left that one out here. So let's look at verse 21 and then see how these things fit together. So I note the association of birds and fish is also made in Psalm 8 here, birds of the air and fish of the sea. So it ought not to be too surprising. But notice that what it's telling us here is that the birds came from the sea. So we'll see that the birds come from the sea, they fly above the earth and across the dome of the sky. So they participate in all the realms of the creation that we've seen so far. So, having said these things, now God created. And this is the first word of use of the verb ber. Remember the beginning story with bereshit. This is a different form of it, via bra, since 1:1. And it will be again used in the sixth day in relation to humanity, and then only a few other times elsewhere in Genesis. So it's a special verb. It's not the normal verb for making something. It's a different thing to be creating something here than to make. And we'll have to make more sense of that as we see further uses of it as we go. But it's highlighting that a different verb is used here and in day 6 for these creatures than was used in the last day for making the lights, the lamps in the sky. So God created the great sea monsters, and sea monster tells us more than the text actually says. Monster suggesting negative because they're going to be blessed, and so usually one doesn't think of blessing monsters. Monster is something bad. What it simply means is large sea creatures, and the Hebrew here is tananim, and it's used elsewhere as dragon. Of course, that's a translation. It says tananim, so the translators rendering it as dragon are just making that decision. But also of the crocodile in the Nile and other kinds of large animals in the sea. It also is the whale or the fish that Jonah's taken up into. So I don't think we really need to get into the question of people, older scholars like Westermann, trying to figure out a specific meaning. I think it's pretty clear that these are simply large animals in the sea, large in relation to humans. And keeping in mind that the sea was such a mystery to people until very recently. You know, there's that dark surface you can't see much in, and if a whale or a crocodile or something else were to pop up from the sea or a river, it would be shocking. You'd have little sense it was coming, and then suddenly you'd be swamped by something much larger than yourself. So the threat of something like that would have been tremendous, and yet they're described as good. These are not opponents of humanity or described even as predators. They're simply part of the diversity of creation that's being made here. As one commentator said, Genesis 1 is a hymn to biodiversity of creatures of every kind as we see here. So it created these great sea creatures and every living creature that moves. And move is curiously an odd word here. Roma Seth, it's used in these places, but then not again in Genesis, right after these places in the primeval history, and only a few other places elsewhere. You'd think for a basic function in life like moving, it might be used more often, but as we'll see, that word has a special purpose. So living creatures, every living creature that moves of every kind, so again noting the diversity, with which the waters swarm, repeating this here, and every winged bird of every kind. And we might think, but aren't all birds winged? But the distinction here, kanaf, kalaf kanaf, winged bird, and only elsewhere here in the flood story, distinguishing non-flying from flying birds. So, for example, ostriches and others who technically have wings, of course, as do chickens, but don't tend to fly. So this is distinguishing flying birds from non-flying birds. And God saw that it was good. Curiously, it says that it's good before the situation is over because this extra verse and action is being put in here. So all these creatures are good. All the sea creatures, all the birds are good. They're not divided into ones that are useful for humans and ones that are harmful. I remember as a kid I had these golden books, Golden Guides to Nature by a guy named Herbert Zim, and they were written in the 50s and 60s when I was a child, and they distinguished insects and other animals based on whether they were helpful to humans or harmful to humans. And so I certainly imbibed at the beginning there are good creatures and bad creatures based on whether they eat our food or whether they fertilize our food or allow our food to grow larger like some insects do. So every creature here is good, at least the ones that are coming out of the sea, but also we'll see in the sixth day the ones from the land as well. And so God blessed them. This is the first time we get to blessing, barakah. Vibarak here is the form. And barakah is an important word. We'll see it plays out much later, of course, especially in the Jacob-Esau story, where barakah is played out against baraka, the blessing and the birthright. Bakora and barakah, so just the consonants reversed there. Here we need to focus on what blessing means, and we'll see more of this as we go, but in our modern use by Christians or often by Jews as well, blessing seems to be anything good that happens to you. So that you won the lottery or you got a job or you got healed from an illness, and that's a blessing. But blessing and curse, as we'll see especially in Genesis 2 and 3, have very special meanings here. Blessing, as you see from the context in verse 22, is what leads to life, and curse is what leads to death. So a parallel example is in Deuteronomy 30. I set before you blessing and curse, life and death, as parallels there. So God blesses, which is to say God's intention is for these creatures to multiply. And so now the command comes, be fruitful and multiply. And the Hebrew here, peru varevu, in sound is parallel and reversed in function from the tohu vabohu we saw as the welter and waste or the chaos upon which God acted in the beginning. So we started with this tohu vabohu, where stuff is just sort of sitting on the table, so to speak, waiting to be organized into separate waters, separate lands, separate creatures. And now we have peru varevu, which is the command to be fruitful and multiply. So now these separate creatures are not only existing, but they're self-replicating. God will not have to make every single one. They will make more of themselves. And certainly a hendiadys here. We saw the question of a hendiadys last time. But fruitful and multiply is two different ways of saying the same thing. One would note here that the Greek tries to preserve a little bit of the parallel of sound here. And oxenesthe kai plethnesthe. You get the nesthe conclusion here at the end of both words as a rhyme. So be fruitful, multiply, and fill the waters in the sea. And notice here another sound play here. Hamayim bayamim. Sorry, Hamayim bayamim. So yamim the sea and Hamayim the waters. So Hamayim bayamim. And let the birds multiply on the earth. Notice that the animals from the sea are said to be fruitful and multiply and fill, but the birds are simply said to multiply. Is there some sense that there's a lesser value for birds? Certainly it's not expressed anywhere else, but that distinction is there, and it's there for some reason. Perhaps you'll come up with a reason, and you can put that in the comments as well. And there was evening and there was morning, the fifth day. So now the air and the sea are filled with animals, and all that's left is for there to be animals on the earth to eat the fruit that was produced on the second day. So we look forward to exploring that with you next time as we continue through Genesis 1. Bye-bye.